Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Vital Dissent. I'm your host, Patrick McFarlane. I don't know which episode number this is. I think it's like 252 or something like that. But on the line, I have good friend of the show, Kyle Matovcik. This is the first time I've interviewed you for the show, but I just ran an appearance, the last interview you did of me. But I just wanted to get you on to talk about this new article that you put out. Your first article for the Libertarian Institute, Bannon, Guo, Yan, where a populist right idol gets his funding. And did Hunter have anything to do with that title, or did you come up with the title yourself?
That was mostly me.
Oh, okay.
Just because it seemed pretty ambiguous as to where Bannon kind of became such a figure. I mean, he was like a Goldman Sachs banker back in the 90s and came from like an Irish Catholic family. And I want to say like a rough part of Virginia. I was just listening to a interview with him today, and then all of a sudden, like all this China rhetoric came out. But obviously we'll get there. So just once I heard about Miles Guo and this connection, I want to say it was originally Robbie Martin who kind of turned me on to this, and it just seemed really, really interesting. I never noticed anybody kind of digging in, and Bannon always seemed kind of sketchy to me, and no one ever really would go to bat against him, because when he's good, he's really good. I mean, like when it comes to assessing the economy and how the middle class is just getting completely screwed by the elite class, he's spot on. But he will often go to bat against libertarians and Austrian economics, because he is a trade protectionist and obviously very protectionist, and just doesn't like Austrian economics or libertarians for that matter. So I know it's kind of all over the place, but yeah, I just thought it was an interesting rabbit hole, and I'm glad that it seemed to do pretty well, at least by my standards.
Well, does he actually talk about Austrian economics, like by name?
Yes. So
Oh.
in a particular interview I was just listening to today, if you look up his name on YouTube, it was a interview done with PBS. And I've even heard him mention on Timcast where he said, like, this Austrian economics doesn't work. All the libertarians are wrong and stuff like that. But then, moments later, he'll go on about how, like, everybody got screwed in the bailout situation. It's like, okay, well, you're kind of conflicting your own ideals here, because Austrian economics is pretty simple and very, very straightforward. And that's why I've always liked it so much. But then you'll point out how like the bailout screwed the working man. But, that's just an example of why Austrian economics actually works, because like in an Austrian economics based model, you wouldn't have these bailouts, right? It would be, if you run your company irresponsibly, you don't get bailed out and you get screwed, and then you're taken over by more responsible ownership. I mean, in my mind, that's the most logical way. So, I've just never understood his problem with free trade and stuff like that. I think it's just largely because his positions on China.
Yeah, it seemed like, I don't know, the best parallel of like a fellow traveler that we have on like this populist paleoconservative track, to me, of course, would be like Pat Buchanan. And I don't know how similar Bannon's views would be to Buchanan. That's really confusing. Their names are just so similar.
Yeah.
But it's like, yeah, in terms of this protectionism, like that's the thing that I cling to, is like, Pat Buchanan's views on China were always more protectionist than like even Murray Rothbard or Lou Rockwell could stomach, even at the time. Because there was, I think Lou Rockwell came out with an article kind of in the 90s saying, okay, enough playing nice with Pat Buchanan because he's just too hawkish on, he's too protectionist. We don't want to deal with that anymore, that kind of stuff. I'd have to, maybe I could pull the article and cite it just in the show notes page.
Sure.
Because I'm sure it was kind of a more complicated relationship in that regard. But yeah, I mean, it does seem like this gets a bit to the crux of what you and I have grappled with a lot with the populist, the new right, the populist right, that they seem to be speaking some of the right language when it comes to other conflicts like Ukraine. Now, I don't know what what his views are on Ukraine, but at least in the Middle East, it seems like they identify the right issue, and a lot of their rhetoric is good. Wasting blood and treasure. What are we doing? Backfiring, that kind of stuff. But then there's always that tinge of, oh, well, Joe Biden is so weak. If only he was stronger. Joe Biden's owned by China. The Chi Coms are coming to get us, and all that rhetoric that's so familiar. So, before we get too into it, though, you want to talk about, just remind the audience like who you are, what you do, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, my name is Kyle Matovcik. I host the In Liberty and Health podcast, just discussing geopolitics, physical fitness, science surrounding nutrition, and also like resistance training. And then obviously, I've had you on a bunch of times and talk mainly anti-war and libertarian kind of stuff. And I've also had some like Republican people on, just to kind of keep the audience balanced, or kind of give everybody all sides. So, yeah, I've been a libertarian for probably about 10 years, and I want to say probably in 2019, 2020 is where I really started to kind of bite onto the anti-war stuff. I grew up around mostly like boomer cons, working in the automotive industry for the last 10 years, and my dad being a shop owner as well. So like my entire life, I've pretty much only interacted with right wingers. So generally what I got was that, the Middle Eastern people are all terrorists. China's the number one threat. They're the enemy. And, just kind of the usual war on terror and terrorist talking points. That's kind of what I grew up with, mostly just like boomer cons and the stuff they would say about that. So, in about 2019, I remember, I think it was Spike Cohen shared a video of Dave Smith, and that kind of really got me down the path of anti-war. And then, Peter Schiff, funny enough, was kind of the guy that got me really raising my eyebrow at all these claims about China, because I remember Donald Trump always saying how we were getting screwed by these trade deals with China. And then when you start kind of scratching the surface of it, you find out that, not only are our economies very intertwined, but I would venture to say that America benefits a lot from this trade relationship that we have with China, because the way that Peter Schiff would put it is that we literally send them paper and they send us goods. So our standard of living greatly increases while their standard of living generally decreases, because all they're getting is, highly inflated dollars that aren't worth a lot, and we get stuff that we could use in our everyday lives, like probably half the stuff in this room. So yeah, I know that's a little bit of a tangent, but that's kind of a brief introduction of who I am and what I do.
No, I don't think it is, because it really kind of gets to the heart of growing up. I said this when Scott was interviewing me about my last piece, and in hindsight, I thought it was kind of dumb of me to say, but I said Americans are most of all the nations, Americans are most propagandized to hate China. Mm-hmm. And he first jumped in and he was like, well, what about Russia? And I'm like, oh, well, you're probably right, because me being 30 years old, I grew up, I was born within a few years of the collapse of the Soviet Union, missing that whole decades, 4 or 5 decades beforehand, where everyone was very propagandized to hate Russia. Right. And then I guess I got some of the, like the Arab hate from the Middle Eastern wars, the global war of terror, that kind of stuff. But I really do think that this fear and hatred of China, at least for our generation, has been so ingrained, more than any other country that I can think of. I mean, you're a blue collar guy, right? I mean, are some of your earliest memories of people complaining about cheap Chinese goods?
Oh man, absolutely. Yeah. The typical tangent goes that everything that breaks in the automotive field, oh well, this is cheap Chinese junk. You and I have talked about it ad nauseum, but yeah, we really are essentially programmed to hate China right from the outset. I remember my bass player grabbing a pedal that I bought off Amazon or something like that, and he looked at it and he was like, "Yep, made in China." And, right. Of course, he's a pretty big China hawk. But yeah, literally everybody will always say, oh, it's cheap Chinese metal, it's cheap Chinese steel, it's cheap Chinese this, cheap Chinese that. And they never quite put 2 and 2 together and realize that like this cheap Chinese stuff raises our standards of living greatly. But, it didn't cost us anything to get it. But yeah, it may not be the best quality stuff, but once again, you could afford to buy this. And there's, plenty of other people on the lower income rung that can't quite afford to buy the higher quality stuff. So this raises their standard of living a lot compared to, the average middle class person. So like just going after China, I get it because this is a great boogeyman because everybody's already kind of saturated with Chinese or anti-Chinese propaganda. And then, you just tell them, hey, well, they're the number one threat. They're committing genocide against their people. A lot of the same stuff that we used to hear about some of the stuff that was going on in the Middle East. Well, now you already have a convenient foe right there. And already most of the blue collar class already doesn't like China. So, I mean, it's just like a natural pivot. And then I was listening to Media Roots Radio today as well, and they were talking about how there were documents dating like back 30 years ago talking about like stuff with space where they were already kind of planting the seeds to start to pivot towards China way back then. So, I mean, this has really been a huge thing that's been building. And it's kind of what upsets me about the populist right a lot because they're good on so many issues, but this is like the big issue because this is the government's number one target. You ask anybody in the State Department, the Pentagon, their target is China, China, China. And they say it all the time. And there's so many right wingers and even a ton of libertarians that just get this issue completely wrong.
Well, I think it's important to. I had an interview with Tommy Salmons, my coworker or my colleague at the Libertarian Institute. And I think one really important thing that he highlighted was that, well, this is a legitimate grievance that people have. And if you can't acknowledge the fact that blue collar people hate China for a reason, then you've lost the plot completely. Because I think that from a perspective of someone who's a blue collar person have seen their communities disintegrate over the years in the Rust Belt, and they see American manufacturing being outsourced to a foreign country, of course they're going to hate that country.
Right.
I mean, if it's responsible for the collapse of their standard of living, and now instead of living in nice communities in Detroit where they can have a boat and 2 cars on a single income, now it's a ghetto, and their kids are on meth, and it's all because the factory job disappeared. And now what? So they're not only on meth or heroin, they're on Chinese fentanyl.
Yeah, that's the other claim. And as you and I covered on the last show, China outright banned that production of fentanyl in 2019, or at least trafficking it, something to that degree. And that's another talking point of the populace right now is that, well, they're trafficking fentanyl over to Mexico, so we should start drone striking Mexico and the cartels and declare war on the cartels because they're killing people with fentanyl. And those numbers seem to be so just unclear. You and I tried to find sources on it. I've tried to find sources on this 300 people dying a day, but you can never quite drill it down where it's coming from. But kind of to the point of like the factories, I always wonder why people don't turn their hatred to their own government that has the boot on their neck. It's probably because all the politicians that they voted for are telling them that your foe's over there rather than right here, right? It's your own government that has their boot on your neck that made all those companies go over there. So why not be frustrated at them for making labor so expensive to produce and do here in the States, and that they thought it was necessary to go over to China. I kind of see this even with people very, very close to me. There's somebody very, very close to me that's doing pretty much a free program right now where she can't get paid. She has to do hundreds and hundreds of hours of essentially free work at hospitals because of the minimum wage. Well, if we got rid of that, then we could solve a lot of those issues, because she would at least be able to make $2. And people may say, well, that's slave wages. Okay, well, she's making nothing now. So what would you rather have, $2 an hour or no dollars an hour?
Right. Yeah, and it's there's always this gray line between what is a state-run company and what is, because everything is the CCP. It's the CCP that's trafficking this fentanyl, and So, anyways, I don't want to bury the lead at all. But back to Steve Bannon. What you were kind of talking about Media Roots Radio, but also what exactly turned you on to this relationship that Steve has with this Chinese defector benefactor?
Yeah, so I remember Robbie mentioning that he was kind of the guy that was really pushing the Hunter Biden laptop. I think that Miles Guo was originally the kind of guy who broke the story. And I remember Robbie mentioning that there were kind of like these ties between Guo and Bannon. So I just started looking, and surprisingly, I think even you noticed this when we were looking into the in writing this article, that there were a lot of like mainstream news outlets that were kind of doing reporting on this. So when you start digging into it, you've seen, okay, well, Miles Guo and Steve Bannon are like really, really good friends, right? The yacht that Steve Bannon was arrested on conveniently belonged to Miles Guo, but actually, when you look into the lawsuits, Miles Guo had tried to offload this on his daughter. Her name escapes me right now. I have it in the article, but she she had expressed that she had no dominion over the boat, but once again, this was the boat that Steve Bannon and Miles Guo were riding around on. So I saw that. Let me see here. Moreover, the yacht on which Bannon was arrested for fraud on belonged to Mai Guo, Miles Guo's daughter. Although, according to a lawsuit filed last year, she never operated the craft and spent very little time on it. I just want to make sure I had that in there.
So it seems like basically the yacht has been offloaded to her for a convenient legal purpose.
Right, because in the situation like Miles Guo's in, where he was actually just recently arrested, I believe back in March, you can't seize his daughter's assets because, once again, she doesn't have anything to do with his, bankruptcy and defrauding people, which is essentially what he's done. So, yeah, Steve Bannon had received, I think it was a $150,000 grant from Miles Guo for strategic consulting services. And then Miles Guo also ran this unregistered security that he ended up having to pay the SEC $539 million because of commingling and just different funds going to places where they weren't supposed to. So when you began to look into his history, you see that, okay, well, he's shoveling Bannon money hand over fist, and he's flying Bannon around on a plane that he has, the Brigadier, I think it was called, and then also on his yacht. And that he also was just essentially financially defrauding people over in China who also kind of had similar interests as him. So just like a lot of different webs that go in all sorts of different directions, always tie back to Miles Guo, where he's ripping people off and then paying people who kind of suit his interests. And Steve Bannon was just one of those people who received a whole ton of money. And it's just kind of funny because Steve Bannon kind of exhibits the same traits and the same kind of doings, where like the We Build the Wall fund was essentially a fraud, and he even admitted as much, and now he's been arrested for that. And I don't think that it was entirely political, but I think it was a little bit political. But if you run a We Build the Wall fund and you defraud a whole bunch of like average blue collar guys who who want a wall built on our southern border, you defraud them out a whole bunch of money. Well, you should go to Slammer for a little bit because you didn't use the money for what you said you were going to use it for.
Is that Steve Bannon?
Yes.
Okay. So a couple things. Just to define who this Miles Guo guy is. He goes by several different aliases, right?
Yeah.
But essentially what he is he's a Chinese national, right? And he is a businessman, but he's also fled China because he's run afoul of the Chinese Communist Party. And essentially that he's a dissident, that he ran afoul of the Chinese Communist Party. Was it for political reasons, or was it just that his business interests, like, the rope ran out and the gig was up?
To me, it kind of seems like the latter, where he really burned a lot of the ends that he had going for him. The one person who filed the big lawsuit against him was Wayne Sean, I believe his name was. I'm probably completely butchering the announcement of that, but essentially he was one of the co-founders of Pacific Alliance Group, where Miles Guo had gotten an enormous loan from and essentially just completely didn't pay him back. So that was one person that he defrauded. And he also had a secretary that he had sexually assaulted. I mean, he raped her. And from what I saw of a lawsuit, it was pretty damning, as in there was evidence, and the investigation that was done was pretty thorough and consistent. And there were apparently quite a few stories that were very, very similar to this. I didn't find quite as much evidence for those. The specific individual that maintained a lot of evidence for the rape charges, her name wasn't released. But yeah, so with Pacific Alliance Group, I believe the loan amount, I want to make sure I get this right here.
Yeah, and while you're looking for that, I guess we should probably say that it's alleged that he raped her, unless it's been proved. Like, has he been convicted of it?
I don't believe he was convicted, but just the case against him, there was a lot of evidence suggesting that he was guilty. Okay, so yeah, he left China in 2014, Miles Guo, that is, and Pacific Alliance Group had given him a loan for a total of $88 million between 2008 and 2011, and then he had never paid them back.
I see.
And the convenient thing about this is that Wayne Sean is also a big CCP dissident as well, where he was very, very critical of the CCP for how they handled COVID. So the thing that I could never quite piece together, it's like, okay, well, you guys have similar goals where you both see the CCP is a bad actor, which I think everybody could agree to. You know, they're definitely not good by any stretch of the imagination. So why would you take all this money from somebody that has the same goal as you and then essentially defraud them? That just didn't make a lot of sense to me. So my kind of general thesis for writing this article was I can't say Bannon in good faith can call for taking down the Chinese Communist Party when the guy who's essentially writing him a blank check, it's in his direct interest to take down the CCP. And one of the things that they did is they announced the new federal state of China. I want to say it was in 2018 or 2020. And basically, this new federal state of China was a rogue government that was essentially built to take down the CCP. So by all definitions, you could pretty much say they're neoconservatives, because neoconservative means that you're trying to promote Western values, you know, free markets, free trade, democracy across the world. Well, that's literally in like the first paragraph of this new federal state of China, is that they say they want to bring Western values, free trade, or not free trade, I'm sorry, but you know, capitalism, free markets, and democracy over to China. And people will oftentimes say that, oh, well, the populist right, they ousted all the neocons, and the neocons hate Trump and they hate the populist right wingers. Well, I don't think it's quite that simple, because it really seems like they just kind of changed their mindset. They shifted. They don't care about the Middle East anymore. They're looking more towards China. Some of them are looking towards Russia in another respect. Some of them are looking at Mexico, and some of them are also looking at Iran, which Steve Bannon really seems to be at the crux of a lot of this, because he's a very, very big cultural figure, but he's also the one pushing a lot of this, like Iranian, you know, anti-Iran stuff, and then also the anti-China stuff. And when you look at, you know, War Room, he's hosting all these populist right wingers all the time, you know, from Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, I believe JD Vance has been on there, but a lot of like the bigger populist right wing figures are, you know, kind of in cahoots with Steve Bannon. Now, I don't know how much he's given their campaigns or anything like that, but you know, somebody that has a reach like Steve Bannon, one of the biggest populist right wing figures there is, it suffices to say that he's culturally very, very involved with this push to bring us closer to a hot war with China. And people have said, oh, he never calls for a hot war, but like, when you're saying we need to overthrow the CCP, I've announced a new rogue government, it seems pretty clear what your goals are, and that is regime change in another country.
Right. And I think regime change is just war by other means. I mean,
Right.
when you talk about, you know, fourth and fifth generation warfare, these concepts, I don't know if James Corbett just had an episode called Fifth Generation Warfare, something like that. But he was talking about how, you know, throughout the years, the entire idea of warfare has changed from generation to generation. You know, there was at one point, you know, we line up with guns and big lines and we shoot at each other, and then it turns mechanized and industrial and trench warfare, and then it turns into, you know, blitzkrieg type maneuver warfare, and now we have a new generation of warfare where basically it's psychological warfare in the minds of every single citizen. And it seems like, I mean, it literally is info wars, right?
Yeah.
So in this, I mean, not to like pat ourselves on the back here, Kyle, but I mean, we're really kind of warriors in this fifth generation. I mean, if the war is being fought in the human mind and that's where the battlefield is, we are warriors, and Steve Bannon is a general, or something like that. And there's always this thought of how nefarious is this? Is Miles Guo, did he create Steve Bannon, as a figure itself, or is it more just, I think Scott said this in one of his interviews, is that basically, well, what are you going to do if you're an enemy of the Chinese government because they've tried to squash you? You have money. Are you going to go out? Well, are you going to go out and foster these people and build them up from nothing to be your mouthpieces? Or are you going to find someone who already kind of believes what you want and give them money to keep doing what they're doing and do it better? And so it just seems to me like, whereas in the past where I would just say it's a massive conspiracy and that Guo is just some kind of, oligarch or something, or one branch of competing branches for the new world order or something. Mm-hmm. It just seems like these very personal motivations that he has, probably against the ruling elite who probably personally wronged him in the past. His whatever's in his history moving forward for him is going to mean coming to the US and funding sources that try to bring down the very regime that's trying to put him behind bars.
Right. Yeah, well, he also ran G News, which is like a whole news network where I think that website was also where his cryptocurrency was hosted. And once again, this kind of goes back to the idea of like culture and how really our culture is saturated with like anti-China propaganda, and Steve Bannon once again being at the front of this. And you can't help but think that Miles Guo had to be in his ear the entire time when he's paying him, money hand over fist, just constantly. And then, they're going out on the boat together and they're saying, hey, they have these corny videos of them in front of the Statue of Liberty saying, take down the CCP, with some, silly little chant that they got going on. And then they're obviously, like I said, announcing the new federal state of China. And that kind of even gets over into a little bit of the stuff with 2020, where this doctor, Li Mengyan, which I wrote about in the article as well, kind of came out of the woodwork and kind of got trafficked around this populist right news network and did a whole tour. And she was responsible for a paper in a website called Zenodo that was basically alleging that COVID was released as a bioweapon in a hostile manner from the CCP. And this was funded actually by Miles Guo and Steve Bannon, conveniently people who also, once again, made this new federal state of China. So once again, isn't it convenient for these China hawks to have somebody out there alleging that China released COVID on the world? And that is the talking point that a lot of populist right wingers are running with, is that China's responsible for COVID. They're responsible for all these deaths, and they did this on purpose. And what a lot of the kind of people on the street, at least the people that I interact with, typically say is that China's responsible for this, and the blood is on their hands, and we need to hold them responsible. And this was intentional specifically because Trump was so, hard on China, which is just like the silliest thing in the world. Because when you start to look into some of this stuff, like this whole trade war, China paid 6% of those tariffs. The rest of it was on Americans. Like, we get 3% of our steel from China. So the overwhelming majority went on American consumers. And people give me pushback on this, but like, how is that a good thing if we're paying 94% of these tariffs and China pays 6%, and we're only getting 3% of our overall steel from China? And that's what I believe a lot of the tariffs were for. So you see this kind of uniformity amongst the right wing here. And once again, at the crux of this is Steve Bannon kind of parroting all these talking points out to all these other dissidents and MAGA Republicans and populist right wingers. And then you also have Li Mengyan, who comes out with a paper in Zenodo saying that, hey, COVID was a bioweapon from the CCP. And, this kind of gives all the populist right wingers credibility because, hey, look, we can point to this paper and say that it was China that did this. Well, once again, when you have somebody with a conflict of interest funding this study, it doesn't smell right.
Yeah, and this person, I don't know if you mentioned this already, but this person, Dr. Li Meng Yan, went on Tucker Carlson, right?
Yes, quite a few times.
Yeah, and talking about this all over Tucker Carlson. And so this connection is really interesting, especially because she was like the craziest, wackiest, like regime change people too, wasn't she?
I believe so. Yeah, she was really calling for an ouster of the CCP. And once again, that's what the whole genesis of her paper was, is to say that COVID was released as a bioweapon. And I think the study was called like anomalies in COVID-19 and how it wasn't natural. I didn't really dig into the paper myself because there's just, as a guy who reads studies on nutrition and stuff like that, it is just like mind-numbingly just like, holy crap. It's like, well, as you would know, it's like legal jargon. It's just you can't decipher this stuff with a straight face. It'll just completely numb your skull. But yeah, so she was going on Tucker Carlson. She also went on a news show. I want to make sure I get this guy's name right. Let me see. Where is it? I apologize. Wang Dinggang. He has a show on YouTube that she had went on where she promoted this paper. But then, also Tucker Carlson's another kind of guy who's, seen as this populist right-wing dissident figure. And he's been very, very bad on China. And he hosted, once again, as we were kind of saying earlier, Li Meng Yan, where she really pushed this paper. And this kind of went viral. I remember when a lot of people were sharing this around about how she kind of broke this paper, and a lot of people were pointing to this as legitimate. But once again, nobody stopped and thought, hey, is there an underlying motive here? It just stops right at China. And this is kind of where a lot of people just, kind of take it and run. Everything's a CCP. TikTok's, digital fentanyl that's poisoning our children with a woke mind virus, and it's spying on us and giving all our info to the CCP so they can sell us cheap microphones.
Yeah, and you get this really weird crossroads where you find yourself as criticizing Li Meng Yan and Steve Bannon. You find unusual bedfellows for us, like
Right.
the New York Times specifically, and people who are just never Trumpers. Right. And that also gives you pause, because it feels like you're being shoehorned into, well, do I believe Li Meng Yan and Steve Bannon and Miles Guo, or do I believe the fucking New York Times, right. Iraq war cheerleaders, liars? And so it was the same thing with this Falun Gong, where is this a case where a broken clock is right, once a day, or whatever the saying goes? It's like, looking into Falun Gong, at least it seems like the New York Times did its fucking job and figured out what's going on. Same thing. There's an article from, I don't know if you cited it in your piece, but from the New York Times, dated November 20th, 2020, talking about Li Meng Yan and Steve Bannon and their connections, and how their idea of this at least being a release by the CCP. And in here, it does say, Mr. Bannon noted that unlike Dr. Yan, he did not believe the Chinese government, quote, purposefully did this, but he has pushed the theory about an accidental leak of risky laboratory research and has been intent on creating a debate about the new coronavirus's origins. So it is just kind of interesting where the effect, when COVID happened, the effect of Donald Trump getting up there and saying, it's from China, it's a China virus. And then everyone says, essentially, well, that's racist. Like, they fucking care. That's racist against Chinese people. And he said, why are you calling it that? And he's like, it's from China. Normal people with their lizard brains just hear that and they think, okay, it's from China, it's a Chinese virus. Where I think the truth has come out more so, and I'm not an expert on this, but it seems like Rand Paul is coming forward and being like, no, it was from China, from US funded NIH labs in China, and it was an accidental leak. Is that your understanding of the situation?
Yeah, that kind of seems to be what it is.
And how convenient is that for us?
Right. Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could call it a bioweapon attack, a psyop attack, a bioweapon psyop attack against the CCP from the US, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm just kind of bulldozing you here, but
No, it's okay. The one funny thing always about the idea that China would have released this on purpose is like, okay, well, why would they release it in their own country and kill their own people? Because anybody who knows about China knows their culture. I mean, there's people writing cultural manifestos over there, and there's, they've had the one child policy for however long. And then, as you uncovered with the whole Falun Gong deal and talking about the Uyghurs, they're not being treated great, but at the same time, they're not being genocided. Like, they're not being lined up and shot in the back of the head. Their people in that country have a reason to be pissed off at their government. So why would they conveniently leak that and then, risk the chance of maybe some kind of uprising when you have people literally writing manifestos?
right.
Now, you could also
Yeah.
take kind of the other direction and say, well, they release it to kill their own people, but like, you would have to have something pretty freaking wicked to kill off, a population of 1 billion people. It just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. But kind of to one of your points earlier, yeah, when it comes to like, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, because you're agreeing with the New York Times, it is kind of a shitty position to take. But also at the same time, we should realize that like, when you have a populist right-wing figure, which you could probably pigeonhole the both of us into being right wing as, blue collar guys who grew up in rural areas and live traditional quote unquote lifestyles. We're both married guys that live in, rural areas with houses that we're paying mortgages on, with dogs and kids, whatever. My perspective on this always is like, we're attacking them from the right. Like, you guys are supposed to be, of blood, soil, and country, but here you are defrauding the average working man, and you're trying to say that you're sticking up for us. And then you're saying, well, China's the enemy. Okay, well, I get your point, but at the same time, they've raised, people like myself, my wife, and then the people I work with, they've raised our standard of living through free trade. So you want to take that away from us? Like, you're destroying the middle class by doing this kind of stuff, because you're making a lot of affordable goods no longer affordable. So, in my mind, it's like, you guys are the phonies here because you're looking to destroy the middle class. And not only that, with this rhetoric, you're giving all the ammunition to the Pentagon and the State Department, who want this hot war with China, because you're saying they're the enemy, they're the enemy. And now, since you're such a cultural icon, now all the people that follow you and listen to you agree with you because they've bought into your ideas, right? In my mind, in order to build movements, you really need this kind of cultural backing to it. You need to have leadership. And Steve Bannon is kind of like this metaphorical general, as you were saying earlier, for this kind of army. And when you have somebody saying what he says about China, you once again cede a lot of ground to the Hawks, because now you've already given them all the ammunition to say the stuff they're saying and build, do this huge military buildup that you've covered a lot and David Camp has covered a lot. You give them all the ground that they need to do all this stuff. And then when you say, hey, well, we shouldn't go to war with them, well, why not? If they're the number one threat and they're killing everybody with fentanyl, what's your excuse? People like us, we could say we've been anti-war the entire time. We've been debunking all this China BS that they're all peddling, so we can have a leg to stand on. But, the populist right-wing figures, they don't have a leg to stand on. I mean, Matt Gaetz was just saying the other day, our grandchildren are going to be speaking Mandarin if we don't stop funding Ukraine. Like,
where the fuck have
ridiculous.
Where the fuck have I heard that before? I remember one of my earliest memories is being in elementary school, sitting with my friends, and one of my friends says, if it wasn't for World War II, we'd all be speaking German right now.
Right.
And guess what? He ended up joining the military and fought in Iraq, or Afghanistan, I think. So that's exactly how it goes. Welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. The best way to do that, guys, is to go to libertyweekly.club. Yes, I haven't changed the URL yet, but this is my membership website that also functions as a newsletter. So if you go to that website, libertyweekly.club, hit the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, and you can subscribe for the free newsletter, and I send out a lot of free content. However, there is a section in those free emails that is premium, and that premium section includes early access to my episodes, access to bonus episodes, and preprints of my articles before they're published at the Libertarian Institute or other outlets. So again, go to the website, hit subscribe in the top right-hand corner, and sign up for that email list. You go through the page here and you can see all the content that I've set out in the past. There's a whole bunch of it, guys, and you get access to those previous emails that have gone out as well. Another way to help support me is to go to vitaldescent.com/Stitch Fix and sign up through my link there. You'll get $25 off your first order, and I will also get a $25 credit. Guys, I use this to buy my wardrobe. I'm a father of two. I have my own business. I do this, and I don't have time to go shopping. Can't haul the wife and kids around to have a leisurely shop for myself to pick these clothes. So what Stitch Fix does is that they pick the clothes for you. They send them to you in fixes, and it's really awesome stuff. These are all the pieces that I personally have bought myself. There's a lot of work stuff in there, but there's also casual stuff. I got an awesome plaid shirt that's in there, a flannel, really love that. I got this really cool sweatshirt. I got these awesome boots and a nice windbreaker, really good stuff. So go on over to vitaldescent.com/Stitch Fix. You can also get Vital Descent, really hard not to say Liberty Weekly, Vital Descent merchandise with the cool, awesome new logo from Mises Pieces. You can get all these kinds of things, all this merch. You got coffee cups, pint glasses, sweatshirts, premium t-shirts, premium sweatshirts, all that good stuff there at vitaldescent.com/merch. Also, guys, I started a TikTok channel, and I think that'll be really cool, trying to get more eyeballs on this content and more views. You can see it's already garnering a bunch of views, where I do anti-war cartoon reviews and a lot of cool stuff there. So vitaldescent.com/TikTok is where you can find me. My handle is at Pat McFarlane_, the same as my Twitter handle. Okay, guys, that's about it. Check out those things. Please help support this content. Help me pay my producer and make the show better for you guys. Thanks. And furthermore, how blue collar is Steve Bannon? You know, all these fucking leaders really pop up. And you were mentioning before, you know, talking about you and I, how you said that we're both blue collar guys. And I respect blue collar guys, but my respect for them means that I have to say, no, I'm not a blue collar guy. You know, I maybe I have some traits of that, but I mean, growing up, my mom was a legal professional and my dad was a landlord, you know, and like we lived in a nice neighborhood, and my dad was a mechanic from, you know, anyways, it's beside the point, but it's like, I wouldn't identify myself as being from a working class family. But it seems like a lot of these leaders who posit themselves as being, or portray themselves as being, populists and blue collar people actually really aren't, that they're from, you know, Ivy League schools, or they have, you know, their parents were teachers or something like that. I mean, university teachers, professors. Do you know anything about Steve Bannon's actual background, like how he grew up?
Well, I kind of touched on a little bit at the beginning of the show, but yeah, he grew up in like a small Irish Catholic kind of family in Virginia. And then he went to college. I can't remember the college that he went to. I was starting to write an article on his history.
Yeah.
But I know he went to college, and then he went off to serve in the military. And he actually was on he was on one of the boats going over to save the hostages during the Iran hostage crisis.
Oh, interesting.
And his boat actually got called back. So that kind of explains his hawkishness on Iran when you look at it through that lens, because he described that as feeling very much so in defeat. He said everybody on that platoon felt very much so in defeat because they were retreating from that whole hostage crisis. So that was part of his background. Then he went back to college for business, and then he actually went on to become a Goldman Sachs guy, right? Which is like the complete opposite of blue collar. Right? I
Yeah.
mean, you're a Goldman Sachs millionaire throughout the '90s, and then eventually he would go on to lead Breitbart News, which he later left and then became the White House strategist for Trump in 27 and 2018. And then I know him and Trump kind of had a falling out, but I still think they're kind of like in cahoots and they're still like on good terms. But I know he left the White House in 2018. So when you look at his career trajectory, it's not blue collar at all. And then, same deal with Donald Trump. I mean, the dude's been a billionaire pretty much his entire life. So, like, these people don't represent me. They
Yeah.
may know what to say to appease people like me, but they don't understand, people like me at all who go to work every single day and bust our knuckles on wrenches and, seized bolts and, broken cars all day. They don't understand what it's like to, start off at 7.25 an hour, working in a garage, changing oil, and then work your way up, to $9 an hour and then to, making a decent middle class living. They have no idea what that's like.
Yeah.
Right. So it's always been kind of funny to me to see, like you were saying, these people champion themselves as populist right wingers and representatives of the working class, but they're the furthest thing from it.
I'm just looking at his Wikipedia history here, and it says he was born in 53 in Norfolk, Virginia.
Yep.
His mom was a homemaker, and his father was a lineman and a middle manager. So, I mean, I guess you could say that at least his upbringing seemed to be kind of blue collar. His family was pro Kennedy and pro Union Democrat.
Yep.
But then, right, he goes to a private Catholic military high school.
Mm-hmm.
Then he goes to Virginia Tech. Then
until 1976, and I believe that's when he went in the military.
Yep. And then he got a master's degree in national security studies from Georgetown. And so, I mean, Georgetown is kind of like an Ivy League school.
Mm-hmm.
And in 85, he got an MBA from Harvard. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I don't know exactly how blue collar you would consider that to be. I mean, the upbringing itself, but then again, he's going to a private Catholic school. So I don't know. Yeah. So, but anyways, I mean, I think the general takeaway from this is just, you got to look deeper and look at people's connections and motivations. And this is not to say that everything that Steve Bannon says is wrong just because he's funded in part by Miles Guo, who's this Chinese dissident, but at least the fact that you shouldn't assume everything he says is correct.
All right. Well, this has kind of been something that you and I think have both been kind of sticklers on, is that people who kind of omit information or put out, I hate saying it because it sounds so ridiculous, but disinformation. So when you have people like Steve Bannon who don't give you the entire story, or people that you and I like to criticize like Tim Pool, who leave out, large tidbits of Donald Trump's foreign policy, that's kind of an issue because they present themselves oftentimes as neutral arbiters of information and they're just reading the news. But the problem is that they don't want to admit they have a bias. And when you look at some of the stuff they're saying, it's like, well, everything you're saying is like pro-Republican, pro-right wing. And that's fine if you're telling people, hey, this is a right-wing channel, I'm very, very pro-Republican, but you're not telling people that. And that is my biggest issue, is that people assume they're getting information without any of the bullshit, right? They assume they're getting all steak, no sizzle. Well, you're getting a lot of sizzle with very, very little steak.
Right. Yeah. And I think, it's an example of what Michael Malice says. And I'm saying this quite, I don't know, kind of ironically. It's like, well, Michael Malice's big idea is essentially that the press lies by omission, right? Is that they're factual but not truthful, which I guess is a way of saying a concept that we all are familiar with.
Yeah.
So And I guess when it comes to like Falun Gong and stuff like that, I try to be, I try to account for my own bias and my own preconceptions. Um, but it's just so damn hard when you have information coming from a group like Falun Gong, and the information they're presenting is just literally, it seems like you can't believe anything that they say, because we have, the industrial organ harvesting stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a hell of a claim.
Yeah. And I was so funny because in the last episode of the show that I did, I actually went through and I played those clips from China Uncensored on Tim Pool. And it's just it's just almost comical. And it's really not, but it almost is, when they're sitting there talking about, yeah, this, wealthy Mongolian businessman or someone from Saudi Arabia will just call up and say, oh, I need a liver from your sweet, sweet Falun Gong practitioners with that Qi energy. Yeah. And everyone's just eating it up.
It's like dystopian, and you would think if they would say that about any other country, I really don't think a majority of people believe it, but because it's about China, people just buy it wholesale.
There's really something about that.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd almost be like, this couldn't pass today, but there's like, have you ever seen the IT Crowd? It's this British television show, like a sketch comedy kind of thing in front of a live audience. Well, there's this episode where Moss and Roy go to, they answer a classified ad for this German cannibal, and they don't realize that he is advertising and he wants people to eat. And so they show up and they think they're going to watch a movie, and he's like, oh, okay, well, I'll get dinner ready. Can I have your bicep or something like that? Well, anyways, it's just like, I think there's this stereotype out there or something about, Germans being cannibals, like Hannibal Lecter or something like that.
Okay.
I mean, what if there was this persistent rumor peddled by a group that Germans were cannibals, and that there was a secret society, or that, there was institutionalized German cannibalism where they had Jews and kept them, in facilities so that they could eat them or something like that. I mean, the truth is ghastly enough that you don't need to manufacture a narrative. It's like, I was reading this article about the new All Quiet on the Western Front, the Netflix movie, that I don't know if you've seen it, but someone was saying essentially this movie is bullshit because it's just anti-war fear porn. Like they take something that's grisly enough and they make it out to be even worse than it actually was, and it just undermines their entire point. It just seems like that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's so frustrating to try and kind of break the mold with that stuff, because like I said, people just buy this stuff wholesale, and it literally does take time to refute bullshit, but it takes seconds to peddle it out, and that's what we get a lot of. And the thing that I think a lot of people aren't considering, and I've tweeted this out before, but we're no longer dealing with the media as it was in 2016, 2018, or even 2020. You could make a very, very solid argument, and I would make this argument, that Tim Pool is more mainstream than mainstream news. So if you look by his views and how long people view his channel, more than likely he is garnering many, 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 many more views than mainstream media. So it's not like MSN, MSNBC, Fox News, CNN. It's not like they're really the mainstream anymore, because Joe Rogan smokes them. Well, even with the least interesting guests he could possibly have. Tim Pool probably smokes all of them on the regular. So we really need to start updating the way that we look at press and media, because I think a lot of people just automatically assume that because it's alt media and they say a few of the right things, that, okay, well, now we can buy their narrative wholesale. What they don't realize is that, once again, they're peddling bullshit as well. And you should be skeptical of all media. I typically say, like, mainstream media or legacy media, you could throw away 100% of what they're saying and you'll probably be okay. Alt media, it's a little bit trickier, just because they're going to give you some factual information and they're going to leave out a lot of it. this is what, Joe Rogan, Tim Pool, all these guys do. And I'm sure that you and I have probably done it before too, where we're just not aware of our own ignorance. But at the same time, when you have somebody like Tim Pool or Joe Rogan who, say, hey, I like Donald Trump for his foreign policy, but then will omit all the drone strikes, the escalations with Russia, China, Iran, and, even escalations in the Middle East. You have to wonder how much this person knows, or if they're purposely leaving this stuff out to kind of guide you in a certain direction. And I don't know where I fall on it. I would say I think maybe they tend to omit that information on purpose because, at the end of the day, the super chats are nice, but that's for those people to decide and for me to speculate.
Yeah, and I don't mean to I've been trying a lot harder to take seriously this kind of Occam's razor idea that the simplest solution is usually the best. Because I mean, I think I mentioned this on the last show. It's just that in my career, I've often had my own theory of the case that is a conspiratorial view that everyone's out to get my client. And this happens all the time. Anyone who's familiar with criminal law or criminal thinking, or even like a family law affair where everything's not always one-sided, and it usually in fact is not, and there usually is not some kind of nefarious conspiracy behind every arrest. I mean, usually your person hit their wife or they had drugs in the car and that's just what happened.
Yeah.
So I mean, goddamn, is it? I mean, I would think that our channels would be so much bigger if we just drank the red Kool-Aid, and by red, I don't mean red. I mean, like if we just became Trumpistans, or if we tapped into that kind of MAGA boomer con populist vein, or even, became a mainstream DNC or woke person, I think that our views, even if we became tankies, anti-war tankies or something, that, I mean, you're talking about a much bigger pool of an audience, pun intended with the pool comment. But I think that being kind of a crotchety, being a neutral centrist fence sitter probably wasn't as lucrative for Tim Pool as being a Trumpistan right winger, anti-social justice culture warrior.
Yep.
I mean, and I don't want to say necessarily that he's being disingenuous about it, because I believe him when he says he's disgusted by all this stuff. And
I do too.
And on his side, I mean, it's easy to see why someone would be disgusted by this kind of stuff. But to completely culture war a stand, you got to know that at least is incentivizing his coverage a certain way. And I think that if we jumped into that fray and picked up the culture war reins, doing what we do, if we talked about that stuff a lot, might gain more traction pretty quickly.
Yeah. And I mean, I touch on those issues a little bit, but at the same time, I'm not going to just carry water for either side as I see it. I'm going to call out things according to the way that I see the world and according to my principles. And I think you do a good job of doing the same. And I think that's what we should do, because I just find this game of playing partisan politics and not calling people out when they fuck up, I think that's dumb, and I don't think you have a sustainable or successful movement that way. I would hope that all you guys would tell me when I'm being an idiot, if I'm being an idiot, because then I know, okay, well, don't do that, you could do it this way. When you just have this blind party loyalty like some people do, I don't see anything really productive other than just kind of the party's wishes getting carried out. I don't know. I'm not that kind of just blanket team player. I'm a very independent thinker, so I'm gonna have my own principles, my own thoughts on things. Sometimes I may completely agree with right wingers. Sometimes I may completely agree with left wingers. But I'm not gonna just say, okay, well, I have to shut my mouth on this because they're good on all these other issues. No, they can be. You can hold two thoughts at once. I can say Matt Gaetz, the work that he's done introducing bills to end the wars in the Middle East, that's heroic. I greatly admire that. But then when he says that my grandchildren are going to be speaking Mandarin, I'd call him a fucking idiot for that
Right.
too. They're not mutually exclusive.
And I think that the blind, you mentioned like the blind party loyalty. I mean, I think it goes beyond that. I think it's a tribal loyalty because, or loyalty to this idea of, well, what is the MAGA culture, or what is the populist right, whatever our vein of that is, or talking about, you know, our pet issues, even of whether it's social justice or whether it's, you know, pedos to the wood chipper. You know, I honestly don't believe that every person who says something like that honestly believes that, because if they really did believe that, they would be going around executing people, you know, or if you put a gun in their hand and said, this person raped a 12-year-old last week, kill him.
Right.
They wouldn't do it. And if they really believe what they said, you know, they would. They'd be doing it right now.
Yeah. It's just a way to basically get clicks. You know, it's spews for views, as one of the people I listen to a lot says. But yeah, I mean, this hyperbolic stuff, like I feel like I can't even comment on some of the stuff because I know if I try to give a nuanced take, you're gonna have idiots on both sides that go to either extreme or sit or claim that I'm on either extreme. And this is what happens a lot. Like if you say Matt Gaetz is dumb on China, then people are saying, oh, well, why can't, you know, you just hate all right wingers. No, I'm criticizing him on one bad thing. I can appreciate him for other stuff, but just because he's bad on this one issue doesn't mean that he's bad everywhere. Like people can't seem to grapple with nuance on these issues. Or even like when you or I say that, like, well, the CCP isn't playing to take over the world and they're not harvesting organs, or they're not using TikTok to indoctrinate our young minds into woke ideology. But they're not like this knight in shining armor. We can hold those two views at the same time, but I've literally had people tell me, well, we shouldn't praise the CCP. When have I ever praised the CCP? I've just said they're not what the American empire is claiming they are. There's a difference here. And you know, you deal with it just as much as I do, but people can't seem to just grapple with the nuance of some of the stuff that we're trying to portray, because we're not just going to give the blanket NPC right-wing take or the blanket, you know, woke social justice warrior Democrat take. And this is kind of like my whole thing. You have a narrative and you have the counter narrative. If the Democrats say that they have diarrhea, then the Republicans are going to say that they're constipated. That's essentially how it goes.
Right. And I think when it comes to like the Chinese Communist parties, like the ball is so far afield that saying, no, it's not quite as bad as you say it is taken as praising the CCP. Where, you know, and I could see that. I mean, I try to be, you know, open-minded and self-aware of what I'm saying, because I don't want to have a knee-jerk reaction of every time someone criticizes the CCP of being like, oh, well, they're a hawk, you know, or, oh, they're completely wrong just because they have a different viewpoint or have that viewpoint or something like that. I wanted to touch on something you said earlier about how Tim Pool is blowing out, you know, traditional media with his views and attention watch hours, probably. Because I think, you know, you think about that and you think about what the key demographics are, right? The key demographics are probably 16 to 30-year-olds or 16 to 35-year-olds. He not only is he killing it, or people like him are killing it with those demographics. But right, it is those demographics. They're killing it with those demographics, and the legacy media is floundering in non-key demographics. And I think that's really interesting and important to note as well. But we talked earlier too about like 5th generation warfare. I think as people who participate in what you could call the info war, I don't want us to try to fight 4th generation warfare. And I think 4th generation warfare would be trying to control the narrative through tackling these mainstream talking points that are as portrayed by the legacy media. That's not where the battleground is. And I think to your point, basically, we should spend more time critiquing and criticizing misinformation. I hate that term because it's a one term. It's a captured term. But we should be confronting this kind of shit and make it a priority to confront it where the key demographic and where the battle is, and not try to fight the war from 20 years ago, which was WMD lies on the New York Times and on C-SPAN.
Right. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And that's why, like, when I see people going after, I hate to say this, but like going after Democrats for like bad economics or stuff like that, or even like the Middle Eastern stuff, and not saying that that's not important, but it's like a lot of that shit's kind of sailed, right? Like this is kind of all behind us. Like when you're attacking the mainstream news, it's like they're already done. I mean, they're gone. It's dead. And that was largely to Trump's credit that he was the one that kind of exposed them and then helped kind of put the nails in the coffin. But the problem is there's still a lot of people that just haven't adjusted. They're still living in 2019 when it comes to assessing the media landscape, but they're not able to get up to date and realize like, oh, now we're going to have to start combating podcasts, right? We have to start, like you said, fighting more current, warfare. We need to be up to date and then talk about what's going on in the alt media space, because that's where all the eyes are. And that's where people of our age range are now consuming their information. They're not turning on Fox News. They're not turning on AM radio on the way to work. They, go onto Spotify, Apple, Podcast Addict, whatever, and they listen to a podcast on their way into work. And that's how they're getting a lot of their information. So we just need to be aware of that. We need to assess the news landscape that way. We can't assess it as we're still dealing with the legacy media, because now mainstream news, once again, is Joe Rogan, it's Tim Pool, it's whatever podcasts, it's these podcasts that have millions of subscribers that people are seeing all over their Twitter feed. That's where mainstream news is essentially. Like I said, I would make the argument that Tim Pool is more mainstream than legacy media at this point, and I don't think a lot of people, even in our camp, are assessing the news landscape that way.
Yeah. And it is, I'm also just kind of thinking about too, though, I'm not saying it's not worthwhile to tackle what's coming from like the New York Times or something either, because it just seems like in the fifth generation warfare, there's so many battlefields that are opening up. If we're to continue with that kind of metaphor, well, it's not really a metaphor. I think it's exactly describes what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Where in the past you had Walter Cronkite telling the news to the nation, or you had, a radio broadcast where the president spoke, FDR's fireside chats or whatever. Mm-hmm. Then you have, newspapers talking about these things, and it was like everything trickled down, or it came from on high. Now you have stratification of it, where you have like the newspapers and like Foreign Policy Magazine and the think tanky blob stuff that seems self-contained, but it is influential in that it influences how people are communicating, at least in the upper echelons and the higher minded stuff. But then you have the TikTok world, right? I mean, at the top, you have these high complex conversations between weapons think tankers and policy analysts, and then schleps like us who write, a renegade kind of insurgent website like Libertarian Institute trying to tackle that kind of stuff. And that's the counterfight. But then you have people in the trenches who are on TikTok and, the lowest forms of media.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we're essentially dealing with what's coined as the too long didn't read generation,
right? Where
people's attention spans are so short, or they want engagement media, right? So like, and this is something that I've kind of grappled with too, like live podcasts seem to be the thing because people want that interaction now. And I think 2020 kind of really brought this out in people, where like sitting there and watching two people talk live on a podcast seems to be pretty popular now. Because it's engagement media, right? You're engaging with the people as they're having a conversation.
Yeah, so you feel like you're a part of it.
Right. Well, Timcast IRL, right? In real life. So you have people in a studio, and then, you have somebody reading your super chats. it's not the same as sitting down to watch the nightly news, because people don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I mean, everybody knows the approval rating on CNN is like awful. The approval rating on MSNBC, you name the legacy media outlet, I mean, they're all going to be abysmal compared to, whatever podcast you could possibly think of at this point. And, if you compare downloads to viewership, if we're in fifth generation warfare. It's a different game now, and people need to kind of get to the forefront of it. But also at the same time, like you said, you have think tankers and the blob kind of setting the narrative initially, and then it kind of being dispersed through the alt media.
Yeah.
So you kind of need to be able to dig through the source material and then assess how people are interpreting that news. So like you have all sorts of things like all sides now that kind of dictate how news is being published, like what kind of bias it has.
And this is where the narrative is born, right? And that's why it's important to confront it there too, because I guarantee you that this Chinese spy balloon narrative, of course, we were talking about it. It was born behind a closed door either in a think tank with like policy analysts from a think tank being involved, or by the military, or by the CIA, the intelligence community, in whatever form it was, crafted this narrative because that's what it's fucking good at, the narrative warfare, and planted these seeds in the first initial coverage. And then your second order politicians get a hold of it, like MTG and Matt Gaetz and all these people who were pushing it. And then it trickles down to people like Tim Pool, who reads the news stories from where it was hatched and regurgitated, and then regurgitates it into your ear holes.
Right.
And then, an even lower order is when some, I don't know, Dash Dabrowski or whoever the fuck his name gets on and makes some psychotic little 15-second rant on TikTok about it,
Yeah. Yeah. And that really seems to be the way it goes. The one thing that you brought up there that just kind of makes me laugh, I remember the video or the picture of Marjorie Taylor Greene with that bomb from the border. And then there was also, I think it was Dave that did it, with the picture of Lloyd Austin with the ball of anthrax.
Yeah.
He was comparing them side by side. But I mean, right there.
Or you mean Colin Powell?
Oh, yeah, my mistake. Yeah. But yeah, so you kind of see it right there, is that we're trying to manufacture consent. And this is what's so frustrating about kind of people who are good on a lot of issues, but bad on one issue that happens to be what I think is probably the most critical issue, is that you want to buy into everything they say because they're so good on stuff that you almost want to excuse that one big issue. But like, I can't swallow, I can't just let that slide when that's that big of an issue. And I really do think people who kind of just dust a lot of the China hawkishness off, I truly think they're just ignorant of how bad that situation is and how fast it's escalating. And we sound like alarmists. I mean, I sound like an alarmist right now, but like, one country is building up militarily around another country, encircling them, doubling one of said countries, partner countries' military budget, saying that we're going to defend these reefs in the ocean here, and we'll go to war if these reefs are, violated. You're sending bombers to another country next to another country. And for those people who did pick up on it, we're talking about America encircling China. I think they're truly ignorant of all this. And like, to break it down on Twitter just takes a lot of time, and people just don't have the patience for it. So it's like, okay, well, what do? Do you just let them, remain blissfully ignorant? I was told it was a progressive notion to tell people, well, actually, all this stuff is happening. But I mean, if it's a progressive notion to say that we shouldn't go to war with China, maybe I'm a progressive now.
Yeah, and I think when I first kind of got turned on and realized that this was a big issue, of course, it was Kyle Anzalone and Dave DeCamp who really made me alarmed about it. But it is that the context that is completely missing of what the U.S. actions have been towards this. And I think that's the main thing that really is completely necessary to frame this issue. I mean, the fact that from the Chinese perspective, the United States is interfering in a civil war by greatly supporting a side and deploying troops to what they see as their sovereign territory. I mean, just in of that explains their motivation if you really understand how they view it. I'm not saying you have to agree with it, even though I think it is the correct take, at least from our own policy. But the idea that, yeah, Taiwan is their it is their sovereign territory from their opinion. So, of course, if the U.S. is interfering with that, it just seems like there's clearly one side who is pursuing their legitimate interests. You don't have to agree with it, but if states exist, then that relationship would be a legitimate core interest. Whereas, if the tables were turned, everyone would be supporting the U.S.'s right to intervene in Puerto Rico, for instance, or something like that.
It's like the old Ron Paul saying, where basically Florida has been a state that's kind of displayed their federalism on their sleeve. So imagine if Russia was over there putting troops into Florida. What do you think would happen? That's just a simple thought exercise. We would nuke Moscow in a heartbeat if they were putting troops into Florida. That's our territory. But that's how China sees Taiwan. They see that as their territory. There's ethnically Chinese people over in Taiwan. So it's a very, very complex issue, and it's not for the U.S. to settle. And people say ma chips, but it's not clear to me that China would completely isolate themselves from the world if they were to take Taiwan, because it's not in their best interest. I mean, that seems really obvious if you know anything about China and how much they have to import. And then on top of that, how many countries surrounding them have border disputes with them, about how people literally fist fight over borders. I mean, who in their right mind would say we're going to close ourselves off from the world when we need stuff from all over the world because we're going to go take sovereign territory of our own that produces chips for the rest of the world? If anything, and from my understanding of the CCP, they're actually very, very, I don't say conservative, but they're very capitalist now. People call it the CCP, but they're very capitalist.
They are conservative, actually. They by any accounts this is why the SJW Chinese social justice narrative is so funny, is because their culture is conservative. They don't put up with any of this, transgender social justice stuff. I mean, the party is socially conservative by any metric in the West. But they are capitalist. I mean, by any stretch, that's what the reforms of Deng Xiaoping ushered in. That was the explosion of wealth that happened in the 1990s. So, and it just, I've tried to think over, the years about an equal parallel to have Americans truly understand the China-Taiwan situation. I mean, it would almost be like, how Hawaii was, there were natives that were living there that the U.S. kind of took over. And it's a very crude parallel, but it's like, what if Hawaii actually was only 100 miles off the coast of California? And if there was a civil war in the United States between the Democrats and the Republicans lost, and they all withdrew to go live on Hawaii and take it over. And the war never really ended. That civil war never really ended. And now China was trying to interfere and support Hawaii against mainland U.S. Or maybe a better example would be, I don't know if it'd be better, if Texas was actually an island and Texas seceded from the United States, and the U.S. thought that Texas had no right to secede, and they were locked in a frozen conflict for 30 years. And then China comes in and wants, if China helped the secession in a way, because the U.S. did support Chiang Kai-shek during the Chinese Civil War, and actually had troops and forces deployed on Taiwan throughout the 50s and 60s. So anyways, yeah, it's an imperfect analogy and it doesn't quite work, but the kind of conception remains. But
yeah.
So, well, anyways, man, I think it's been great having you on, and I'm really glad that you wrote this article. Again, for everybody, it is Bannon Guo Yan, where a populist right idol gets his funding. It's at the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org. I'll put a link in the show notes page, and it sounds like you're working on another piece, maybe. I don't want to wedge it to anything, but
I was kind of starting one on Bannon's history, but there's another character that kind of came on the radar, Lou Dobbs. I'm not sure if there's anybody that's done any kind of diving on him, but from what I understand, he's also been a real big China hawk even before like China really got the limelight. So I may do a little bit of digging on there. After my first article seemed to do well, I figured maybe that should be something that I should try to do a little bit more often. But well, just as well as I do that kind of doing dives like that takes some time, and
oh god, yes,
it's a grind. And that article for me was a grind, especially because I never did one before. But it's well sourced, and I think I portrayed my point pretty well, and I think people hopefully got a decent bit out of it when it came to kind of the origin of, I don't want to say the origin, but where a lot of this China hawkishness comes from, and especially like the stuff with COVID as well.
Earlier when I asked if Hunter had anything to do with your title is because the reason I asked that is because I'm terribly shitty at writing titles, and Hunter has come up with really, really good ones for me in the past. But also, I'll credit to Will Porter, our editor, who just like takes stuff and turns it, like he makes things incredibly readable into like, it's like Connor says it, when he works with a piece, it's like he takes something that can be clunky at times and turns it into a water slide, as your eyes just slide down the page because it flows so well when he gets done with it.
He definitely did that for me.
Yeah, and he's done that. He did that's why he got a credit on the last podcast I talked about my article about China. He did a bunch of editing and helped us out with the readability of it. So all right, well, you want to tell everyone where they can find your work?
For sure. Yeah. Well, you can find me at KYLEMATOVCIK. That's Kyle Matovcik on Twitter. My link tree will be there, but you can find my band at A Common Crown. If you look us up, go to commoncrown.com. You'll find us on all streaming services. The podcast is called In Liberty and Health. I'm not sure exactly when you plan on airing this, but May 5th will be my 200th episode. I usually do 2 episodes a week. I did 3 episodes this week as we're recording. One with Sean Russell and Adam Fitzgerald on the Canistero documents about 9/11, which was really, really interesting. I had Angela McArdle back on to talk about the Libertarian Party and the Liberty Movement, and then doing a live stream Friday night. Next week's episodes are going to be pretty interesting, kind of stepping away from some political stuff, mostly health and fitness, and some music stuff. So you can find me, like I said, Twitter, Facebook, mostly active on Twitter, and the podcast and my band everywhere where you find music and podcasts.
Awesome, man. Yeah, well, thanks for coming on. Write another article and we'll do another one.
For sure, man. I kind of got some ideas, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I gotta fucking write something. I'm overdue. But okay, all right. Well, we'll catch you next time. Thanks, everybody. Peace.